Welcome to Hatchet Talks, everyone. Thank you for joining my session today. Before we get into the details of the session, I want all of you to think about the last time you wrote some infrastructure configuration in your favorite IAC tool and had to go through some security reviews before it could be promoted to production. You realize that your organization follows a certain policy framework, you have a certain policy as code language, or a framework or a rule that you use, or maybe you work with security consultants who ensure that your configuration matches their expectations. If you're in any of those scenarios, I want you to think about situations where new policies being added or new services are being added, which you're interested to consume, let's say from the AWS standpoint. How do you keep up with those? How do you add those policies? How do you update those policies so that your organization's policy set or the set of policies that you need to work with is continuously improved and still compliant with the frameworks that you want, or helps ensure that your infrastructure configuration is compliant? I'm Manu Chandrasekhar. I'm a senior DevOps consultant with AWS. I'm here to talk to you about crafting security policies for your infrastructure using Amazon Q. Let's set some context, right? I work with customers who want to provision workloads in AWS. And many of them use Terraform as their IAC tool of choice. And so when I work with them, there are a few things, and they may already have some policy as code frameworks or that they need to adhere to from the standpoint of security and compliance. They may have or may want to pick a policy as code tool framework or a policy as code tool from that standpoint. So what are the components involved at that point, right? We have the Terraform AWS providers, which essentially acts as the plugin or the source of truth for any target platform that you want to work with to provision those resources in. Terraform as such doesn't know what AWS is, but with the AWS provider, it does have that extensive idea about what a schema of a resource looks like and how to provision them. Policy as code, again, it has sort of become de facto in line with the DevOps movement, along with the IAC side, making sure that policies are not in a security consultant's mind or head or in a documentation's line somewhere. They're written, they're testable, they can be consumed across your lifecycle, and it's consistent. And your organization may already have a compliance framework that they need to use across the lifecycles, whether it's CIS, whether it's NIST, or the foundational best practices, which AWS wants everyone to follow. For the eagle-eyed, you would notice that I did not say Terraform AWS provider, but rather Terraform AWS providers. Yes, there are two. AWS provider, which you have known and loved over the years, the AWSCC or AWS Cloud Control Provider, which has been in existence from around 4 years, but went GA last year. Again, there are multiple YouTube sessions, HashiCorp sessions, AWS-driven conversations around what this provider gives you. Essentially, it allows AWS and the provider engineering team to give you the latest and greatest of AWS services and features right around the time of launch. So that is just about the providers. Now let's talk about the policy side. Anyone who's currently on this call, I'm sort of thinking that all of you are familiar with the idea of policy as code. Essentially, translating the policies or the compliance frameworks that you need to adhere to, your infrastructure needs to adhere to, in the form of code, which could be tested, which should allow you to have that automated enforcement across your lifecycle, even from your development machine, even up to a CI/CD pipeline, which deploys it. Version controller, which means you can have it in a source control repository. Everyone can refer it, contribute to it. You're bringing the compliance early in the lifecycle, as I said, even from a developer machine standpoint. You can actually bring that up there as pre-commit hooks or anything of that nature, which helps you to ensure that the developers or module authors or anyone who's creating these Terraform or infrastructure configuration in general are able to create them in a secure fashion. Again, as it's written in code, it's available, it's can be used across lifecycle, it can be consistent. It gives you that consistent experience across the lifecycle and at scale. Now, there are a lot of security, there are a lot of policy as code tools and libraries out there. I'm going to focus on two which I'm familiar with. And one of the biggest challenges with some of the tools or libraries is that you need to, again, they are good to start with. After a certain while, you would need to have that much experience in those specific policy languages to write those policies that you or your organization needs. And that's the same across all policy code tools. You have your own choice, you have your own favorites, or your organization has your favorite, which ends up being your favorite. To help support that, again, some of these policy code tools already have some pre-built libraries. Like Sentinel has some for AWS provider policies across CIS and I want to say foundational best practice at this point. Checkov already has some pre-built and added in by the community. So they all provide good enough starting points for anyone who's starting with AWS, deploying workloads in AWS. But what's missing here? Now, I said there are two AWS providers. When I looked at the policy listings and policy sets that are covering resources, helping you to deploy or provision workloads in AWS, it was missing AWSCC provider in its entirety. So I started on a goal. I want to add support for AWSCC provider from the policy frameworks like Sentinel, policy languages like Sentinel, or Checkov, both of which I was familiar with. I haven't written a lot of policies, but I've written a few. So if I'm looking at, let's say, irrespective of what policy engine I'm taking, what are the steps which I should focus on before creating a policy or before creating a specific set of policies based on a framework? I want to understand and review that policy framework, whether it's CIS, foundational best practices, NIST, or anything of that nature. I want to identify the resources in the provider which they apply to or map to. In this case, I'm taking the case of AWSCC provider. You want to create those policies for each of those policy engines. Sentinel has its own DSL or its own, language. Checkov can be written in Python or YAML. And you're not done there. Whenever a new policy is added, or whenever a new resource comes under support or comes under a policy's purview, you may have additional policies to be written. Or maybe there's a feature which updates the way a policy is inferred. So you have to repeat these steps over and over again on the basis of those changes coming across. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the details of, or show you the details of policies that I've written. As I said, I started off with few after the tutorials. There were many. Now, the natural question at this point in time, in this juncture, is how can I automate this? Or can generative AI help? I want to say much of this inspiration comes from the conversation I had with a few of the AWS folks and HashiCorp engineers I was working with at that point. And if you remember, we had a conversation around something similar using Amazon Bedrock and AWSCC provider documentation during the last Hashi Talks. Some of the slides may look very similar because it's intentional. I want to make sure that this is sort of you can understand or follow along if you've seen that and it makes sense that, hey, this is the next step or the next thing in that series. So I started looking at the generative AI stack available to me. As I said, one of the previous Hash Talk sessions that we had was focused on using Amazon Bedrock with the orchestration layers to create those documentation with those examples and things like that. Now, in this case, our focus is on Amazon Q Developer, specifically the Q Developer CLI. The Amazon Q CLI refers to the command line interface of Amazon Q Developer, which is a generative AI powered system, which is designed to help developers, have that additional productivity within the AWS ecosystem. Now, I'll focus on QCLI at this point. I said this is inspired by a conversation or a talk that we had in 2025 about AWSCC documentation. So I'm going to bring in the hypothesis, which is very similar from how I had before. I had LLMs in there. In this case, I'm saying, hey, I'm going to give those details to Amazon Q and see how it reacts. Now, for me to create a new set of policies, again, this is on the basis of some of the experience, some of the learnings I had with respect to how Q reacts or any of those models at this point react. Peer conversations are asked around helping you create something. In this case, I wanted to create new policy examples or new policies specifically matching those specific policy frameworks. I need access to AWS provider schema because I wanted to be sure of what resources are existing. It needs to have access to AWS documentation for those specific policy frameworks. It ties those policy frameworks back to the resources it maps to. And interestingly enough, those policy frameworks also call out the CloudFormation schema resource, or it maps to the CloudFormation resources, which AWSCC also maps to. On top of it, focusing here just on Sentinel, but again, it's similar in the case of Checkov. I want to use the HashiCorp docs as a frame of reference for Sentinel policy language. There are certain nuances to the policy language itself and how you structure your tests, how you structure your mocks, and how Sentinel expects them to be in a certain format. If you work with Sentinel, you're already familiar with it. And in the course of time, I realized it helps to have some policy examples, as whether it's from AWS provider or AWSCC that I wrote. For QCLI, use the additional information that I'm providing and use that to create the policies that I want. So the expectation is Q will use these examples and details to generate the required policies. And I feel like the first three things that I'm supplying, they are either documentation or existing provider schema and things like that. The world has moved or changed a lot from the time I started working on this. MCP is a thing, and it definitely helps QCLI in this context, giving more details on what's possible with respect to getting more relevant information, more up-to-date information with respect to the documentation and the registry itself. So I can use the Terraform and AWS documentation MCP service, augment what QCLI knows to help me create these Sentinel policies. Enough of the slides. Let's get into the demo. Now, in the demo, I want to showcase three things. We want to create a Sentinel policy from scratch. You will see the different motions Amazon QCLI goes through to identify the structure, go through creating the policies, and creating the documentation and things like that. And we'll see how we can scale it across different services from a security policy standpoint. And I did say this is for both Sentinel and Checkov. And I follow the same structure, similar mechanisms, and similar path with Checkov as a policy language. And I've created some policies also. And I want to showcase what the effect of those is on existing AWSCC resources that you may be using. So let's get into the demo. I'm going to pause in between to showcase, talk through what you're seeing in here. I'm going to start the Q interface with a Q chat command. And you can see there are three MCP servers getting initialized. the AWS Labs core server, which is required, the documentation server, which is going to help me solve through the AWS documentation, and the Terraform MCP server itself. Now, the first request in here is very simple. Hey Q, can you create Sentinel policies for the S3 control called S3 3.8 or S3.8 for the CIS policy framework? So I've defined the policy framework. I'm saying which policy or which security control, and I'm saying which provider I want the Sentinel policy to be created with. If you start to think, there are a few steps in here, as you notice. So it's going to tell you, hey, I'm going to try to create these policies for you. I don't know what CIS framework is at this point. I may have to examine the existing documentation available. And I'll talk you through the rules a little later. It has some existing tools available, like, for example, in this case, using the search documentation to identify what that S3.8 Security Hub control means. It's going to identify what that is, read through the documentation from AWS side, in this case, CIS Foundation Policy or the CIS Policy Framework. And it'll identify that it is what it says as S3 general purpose bucket should block public access. So you identify where the control is. Now, if I scroll up, oh yeah, it's already trying to get in the AWSCC documentation at this point. Okay, so this is the second step. It's trying to identify if such a resource exists. That's it. Every one of these security hub controls have a CloudFormation schema resource, a CloudFormation resource associated to it. With AWSCC being mapped to the CloudFormation schema and the CloudFormation schema registry, it helps it much more that it's able to translate that resource into AWSCC provider. The thing that QCLA is going to do is identify if such a resource exists and if such a property exists for it to do their actions. Once you identify the resource, it goes through the motion of setting up Sentinel policies. I've given it a simple CloudTrail policy or a couple of CloudTrail policies as an example, because Sentinel itself has its own structure. So I want it to be easy for QCLI to be able to use that structure for Sentinel test to work. Then I create the S3 policies. And it's going to start creating the policy. So there are a few things involved in a Sentinel policy if you're newer to Sentinel. You have the policy code per se. You have the test. You have the mocks for the test, which helps you test that particular policy against it. And in the meantime, it's trying to create those policies. You might see some failures out there, which is fine, because as we give QCLI access to Sentinel, we are essentially asking QCLI at this point to say, hey, make use of that particular tool that I've given access to, along with MCP servers. Test it, verify. If you see some issues, fix it along the way, and try to make sure the test passes. And that validation is really important. Whether it's creating Terraform modules, whether it's creating Sentinel policies, whether it's creating any sort of code that we have, having a baseline of test, having some sort of mechanism to validate that what you've created is working, definitely improves your confidence in what that particular generative AI system is creating for you. So QCLI, with my permission, was given access to run Sentinel as a tool in my local system. It goes through the policy structure, runs Sentinel test, and ensures they're passed. Once it's passed, you can see it's specifying what sort of running through verbose mode. There's a reason it's running verbose mode too. It's trying to get the details of what's running and the trace from the logs so that it can use it in the documentation. Now, I have these listed as a nice to have, but QCLI understands that once the policies are created, I want to document that, because if you've ever published a policy library into Terraform registry, it's good to have some documentation out there. So this documentation helps you to communicate to the user that this is what you're trying to do with this particular policy. Now you've created the policy for it. And it's going through a structure similar to what we have in the document. So I'm opening Hero. That's my daily driver at this point from a coding standpoint or IDE standpoint. We're looking at the documentation that QCLI created for us based on the policy that it created. If you look at the policy, it already had a CloudTrail folder or a directory, and it created the S3 directory, the the policies and mocks and the test out there. An additional README specifically for that particular S3 policy out there too. It created a Sentinel.html file which should have the additional policies if you added more. I did not add the one for CloudTrail, but ideally you should have that too. Now, how do we scale this? We only created a policy for a single resource against a single policy framework. That's not going to get us much. Now, let's see if we can scale this across different policies. Again, I'm doing this for all the SNS topic controls. Rather than creating it, I'm asking QCLI at this point to create an implementation map or implementation plan. Let's add a note not to include estimates, that's all. Now, what it's going to do in the background is it's going to follow the same process as it did before, using the trusted tools that it has access to. It reviews what SNS topic controls exist in Security Hub. It identifies there is SNS 1, 2, 3, 4. Which one maps to FSVP or CIS, which is the relevant resource on the AWSCC side, and found out that SNS4 is the only one which is part of FSVP standard. And now it's, once it identifies, it actually creates an implementation plan for us. In the sense that it'll tell you, hey, this is the particular resource that you have, this is the particular control that a particular resource maps to, and you should create a policy for it. What's the best thing about it? You can do that for all the resources and all the security controls that you're interested in and create implementation plans. And it can feed that back into QCLI and have it create those policies for you. With implementation plans, it's sort of a good mechanism to help you build that list of items that you are trying to create. And you can have QCLI mark the ones that are already completed, and continue with or resume where it stopped off from the last time. What you've seen till now is a quick demo of how you can create Sentinel policies for a specific resource for a specific control and scale that up using an implementation plan for all the possible security controls for a resource or even further. So that's it for the creation of the policies, right? Now let's take a look at the actual rules that I had in place for QCLI to follow. As you can expect, again, QCLI has been asked to create certain policies. And this is basically for Sentinel at this point. As I said, I've given it a role, saying you're an agent that is specialized in running Sentinel policies. You're aware of the AWS documentation. There are certain things which I added to make sure it understands and it's easier for it to figure out, though it will figure out eventually. But as I work through the code, I thought it'd be easier to say, hey, for a CloudFormation resource that is mapped to AWSCC resource, it's an easy map, as in replace the double columns with an underscore, things of the nature. On top of it, I was giving QCLI structure to follow from the standpoint of how a specific policy need to be written, the naming conventions around it, how tests and mocks need to be written as well. So it's able to follow that convention and create policies. And along with the example that we gave for CloudTrail, it was able to create the ones for S3 that we asked for. Now there is a certain flow in here. One of them is around, hey, what is the general structure and configuration that you want to have? There are some requirements that I want you to strongly create, like what I'm calling as should requirements. There are a few which is may, or some which is like nice to have, right? I asked for documentation. It actually created this documentation. So that was one of those ones that I asked for and created. And again, this is that, what I'm showing you right now is the actual implementation map that is created for that SS topic. So what you're going to see is a simple example of an EBS volume, one which has encryption enabled, another which doesn't. We're going to look at Checkov policies, which by default, which doesn't sort of fire on it because it is for AWSCC resource and the policy doesn't understand it. It is written for AWS at this point. Now, introducing the additional checks that I wrote, let's see how it behaves. You can see that the fail on fails, the pass on pass. So the one that is expected to pass is pass because it is looking at that encrypted property on the ABS wallet, which is supposed to be set to true. So that's it for the demo. We looked at three things: creating Sentinel policies from scratch, creating an implementation plan, even though for one resource, you could extend it or scale it for every resource possible. And the other one is just a quick validation of AWSCC resources using Checkov, using the custom checks. To summarize, I urge you to download and try Amazon QCLI and consider providing it access to tools with whatever tools you're working with, whether it's creating Terraform, whether it's creating Sentinel. Explicitly give it access to that, saying, hey, you have access to this particular tool to validate its own work. It actually does wonders because it helps to self-correct on the basis of the feedback, or if you have some specific steps that you use to validate, whether it's the same set of steps that you use to create that particular artifact, whether it's Terraform configuration, Sentinel policies, Checkov policy, anything of that nature. Again, while I was doing all of this, I was still reviewing the output, some of them more on the basis of the tests that I have. Checkov is probably a little bit easier to validate with the tests that you can write in Python itself. There's definitely other use cases that where Amazon QCLI and a similar approach would work. You can create new resource in AWS provider when a new service gets released. Creating secure Terraform modules to start with, right? Getting that feedback around using security helpers like Ash, which has its own MCP server. Going through and reviewing your code as you write it. If you have failed security checks, use Amazon Q to sort of give you an idea of how to fix those. And in general troubleshooting. I want to leave you with a couple of repositories. These, have the custom checks that I'm talking about from a AWSCC standpoint, whether it's Checkov or it's Sentinel policies. Do take a look at it, give it a run. I'll keep it updated as much as I can based on the changes in policies, changes in the new resources that are coming across the AWSCC side. I want to leave you with one more thing. If you're coming to HashiCorp, there are a few other sessions. Again, one speaking session for me, which sort of continues the series from documentation to policy creation to other realms that I talked about. Value session would be the grounding AI and reality session would be more about the how of how you can bring determinism into the flow. Mine would be more about what additional use cases that I've had success with. And if you want to dive deeper into the MCP servers available, Gautam Bhagal session around from code to context is the best thing that you can look for. If you're there in HashiCorp, please come by the AWS booth and say hi. Hope you found the session useful. I'll be in the chat, answering any questions that I can. Thank you for joining.